Chapter 5. Kristin went to the palace the next evening as soon as she was come into the city. "Where in all this great mansion have they put Erland?" she thought, as she looked around at the many stone houses. It seemed to her she thought more of how Erland might be faring than of what she might have to learn. But she was told on asking that the treasurer had left the town. Her eyes smarted after the long boat journey in the glittering sunlight, and her breasts, overfilled with milk, troubled her. When the serving folk who lay in the room were gone to sleep, she got up and walked the floor all through the night. Next day she sent Haldor, her own man, to the palace. He came home terrified and unhappy. Ulf Haldarsson, his father's brother, had been taken prisoner on the fjord, trying to come over to the cloister at Holm. The treasurer was not yet come back. These tidings put Kristin too in the greatest fear. Ulf had not dwelt at Huseby this last year, but had been working as one of the warden sheriffs, for the most part in Vjoldfurkstad, of which he now owned the greatest part. What kind of cause could this be, in which so many men were entangled? She could no longer keep at bay the worst fears, sick and worn with waking, as she now was. On the morning of the third day, Sir Bard was still not come home, and a message that Kristin had tried to send to her husband did not reach him. She thought of seeking out Gunnulf in the cloister, but felt she could not. She walked and walked up and down the hall at home, with half-shut, burning eyes. Sometimes it was as though she were waking half in her sleep, but as soon as she lay down, the fear and the pains came over her again so strongly that she was forced to rise again, broad awake, and walk, so as to endure them. Just after mid-afternoon, Gunnulf Nicolausson came into her. Kristin went swiftly to meet the monk. "Have you seen Erland? Gunnulf, what is it they charge against him?" "There are heavy tidings, Kristin. No, they won't let anyone come near Erland, least of all us cloister folk. They believe that Abbot Olaf has been privy to his plans. It is true he borrowed money there, but the brothers all swear that they knew nothing of what he meant to do with it when they put the convent seal to the deed, and the abbot will give no account of his doings." "Aye, but what is it? Is it the Duchess that has lured Erland on to this?" Gunnulf answered, "It seems rather as though they had to press her hard before she would join in their plans. The letter that someone has seen a draft of, which Erland and his friends sent her last spring, they can scarce lay hands on, I think, except they forced a lady to give it up to them, and they have found no draft. But by the answering letter and Sir R. Glorason's letter, which they took from Borgar Tronson at Vioi, it seems sure enough that she had such a writing from Erland and the men who had bound them to stand by him in this plot. It seems to be clear that she was long afraid to send Prince Hakon to Norway, but that they urged upon her that, whatever the outcome of the matter might be, 'twas not possible that King Magnus should harm the child, his own brother. Should Hakon Knudsen not win the crown of Norway, he would not much be worse off than before. But these men were willing to venture their lives and all their goods to set him upon the throne." For a long time Kristin sat quite still. "I understand. These are greater matters than those that were between Sir Erling or the Haftorsons and the king?" "Yes," said Gunnulf in a low voice. "It was to be given out that Haftorgraut and Erland sailed for Bjorkvin, but it was Karlundborg they were bound for, and they were to bring Prince Hakon back with them to Norway, while King Magnus was yet abroad about his wooing. A little after, the monk said, still low, "It's more than this. It's well nigh 100 years now since any Norwegian noble had dared the like of this. Tried to overthrow him who was king by inheritance, and set up a rival king." Kristin sat gazing before her. Gunnulf could not see her face. "Aye," she said in a while, thoughtfully. "The last men who ventured on that game were your forebears and Erlands. And that time, too, my dead and gone kinsman of the Giesling house stood by King Skule." She met Gunnulf's questioning look and burst out, hotly and vehemently. "I am but a simple woman, Gunnulf. I didn't pay much attention when my husband spoke with other men of such things, and I was unwilling to listen when he would have spoken of them with me. God help me, such weighty matters were beyond my understanding. But, simple woman as I am, unskilled in anything but my household work and the nurture of my children, even I know that right and justice had too far to travel before any man's cause could win through to the king and back again whence it sprung. And I have understood too that the common folk of this land have less prosperity and harder times now than when I was a child and King Hakon of blessed memory was our overlord. My husband," she breathed quickly and tremulously once or twice, "my husband, I see it now, has taken up a cause so great that none of the other chiefs of this land dared set a hand to it." That he had. The monk clenched his hand together tightly. His voice sank to a whisper. "So great a cause that many of them will think an ill thing that he should have himself brought about its downfall, and in such a way." Kristin cried out and started up. The sudden violent motion made the pain in her breast and arms so sharp that her whole body was bathed in sweat. Wildly and feverishly she turned on the monk and cried loudly, "'Twas not Erland did it! It was doomed so to be. It was his evil chance." She flung herself forward on her knees, with her hands pressed against the bench, and lifted her flushed, despairing face towards the monk. "You and I, Gunnulf, you his brother and I his wife for 13 years. We should not throw blame on Erland, now he is a prisoner, in peril of his life, maybe." Gunnulf's face quivered. He looked down at the kneeling woman. "God bless you, Kristin, that you can take this matter so." Again he wrung his wasted hands together. God grant Erland life and the power to repay you for your faithfulness. God turn away this evil from you and from your children, Kristin." "Don't speak that way." She drew herself upright on her knees and looked up into the man's face. "No good has come of it, Gunnulf, when you have stepped in Erland's affairs and mine. No one has judged him so harshly as you, his brother and God's servant." "Never has it been my will to judge Erland more harshly than I must." His white face had grown yet whiter. "No one upon this earth have I held so dear as my brother. It may well be, therefore, that it wrung my soul, as it had been my own sin that I must myself atone for when Erland offended against you. And then there is Huseby. It was for Erland alone to carry onward the race that is mine as well as his. The greatest part of my heritage I gave into his hands. Your sons are the men that are nearest to me in blood." "Erland has not offended against me. I was no better than he. Why do you speak so to me, Gunnulf? You have never been my confessor. Sira Eirik did not blame my husband to me. He corrected me for my sins when I laid bare my troubles to him. He was a better priest than you. And he it is that God has set over me, that I should hearken to him. And he has never said that I suffered wrong. I will hearken to him." Gunnulf had risen when she stood up. He muttered, his face pale and troubled, "You speak the truth. 'Tis Sire Eirik you must hearken to." He turned to go, but she caught his hand impetuously. "No, don't go from me this way. I remember, Gunnulf, I remember when I was your guest here in this house. It was yours then, and you were good to me. I remember the first time I met you. I was plunged in fear and pain. I remember you spoke to me in Erlend's excuse. You could not know. You prayed and prayed for my life and my child's life. I know that you wished us well. You held Erlend dear. Oh, don't speak harshly of Erlend, Gunnulf. Which of us is clean before God? My father grew to be fond of him. Our children love their father. Remember, he found me weak and easy to lure astray, and he set me in a good and honourable place. Oh, yes, it is fair at Huseby. The last evening before I left home, it was so fair. The sunset that evening was so beautiful. We have lived many a good day there together, Erlend and I. However it may go, he is still my husband whom I love." "Kristin, do not trust to the sunset glow and to the love. You remember now that you fear for his life. I remember a thing when I was young, a subdeacon only. Gutbjorg, that was wedded with Alf of Uverhasen, was a servant at Heim then. She was charged with stealing a golden ring. It came out that she was guiltless, but the shame and fear had so shaken her soul that the enemy won power over her. She went down to the lake and would have thrown herself in, and she often bore witness for us afterwards that, as she went in, the world seemed to her so red and golden and fair, and the water shone bright, and felt warm and comforting. But when she stood in it to the middle, she was moved to name Jesus' name and cross herself. And then did the whole world grow grey and the waters cold, and she saw whither she had been bound. Then I will not name it." Kristin spoke softly. She stood stiffly upright. "If I could believe that, then I would be tempted to forsake my Lord in his needs. But I think could not be Christ's name, but rather the enemy's, that could do the like." "I didn't mean that. I meant, God strengthen you, Kristin, to bear your husband's faults with a loving spirit." "That is exactly what I am doing," said the wife in the same tone. Gunnulf turned from her, white and trembling. He passed his hand over his face. "I will go home. At home I can more easily gather my thoughts, that I may do all that lies in my power for Erlend and you. God and all holy men preserve my brother's life and freedom. Oh, Kristin, never believe that my brother is not dear to me." But after he was gone, Kristin thought that all things were grown worse. She would not have the serving folk in with her, but walked and walked, wringing her hands and moaning softly. The evening had grown late when there came a noise of people riding into the courtyard. A moment after, the door was opened, and a tall, stout man in a riding cloak, first dimly seen in the twilight, came quickly towards her with jingling spurs and trailing sword. When she knew him for Simon Anderson, she burst out into loud sobbing and ran towards him with outstretched arms, but she cried out in pain when he drew her to him. Simon loosed his hold. She stood with her hands on his shoulders and her forehead leaned upon his breast, sobbing helplessly. He put his arm lightly about her. "In God's name, Kristin!" It seemed as though there was rescue in the very tones of his dry, warm voice, in the living smell of man that came from him, mixed of sweat, dust of the high road, horses and leather garments. "In God's name, it's all too soon to lose hope and courage yet. There must be some way out, for sure." In a little she had grown calm enough to beg him for pardon. She was quite sick and wretched, she said, for she had had to take her youngest child from the breast so suddenly. Simon learned how she had fared these 3 days and nights. He called her serving maid and asked angrily if there was not a single woman in the house that had wit enough to know what ailed their mistress. But the woman was a raw young maid, and the bailiff of Erland's townhouse was a widower with 2 unmarried daughters. Simon sent a man out into the town to fetch a leech woman and bade Kristin go to bed. When she had grown a little easier, he would come in and speak with her. While they waited for the leech woman, he and his man were served with food in the hall, and over his meal he talked with her as she undressed in the closet. Yes, he had ridden north as soon as he had heard what had befallen at Sundbu. He had come to Nidaros, and Ramborg had gone to Sundbu to be with Ivar's and Borgar's wives. Ivar they had taken to Mjø's castle, but Havard they had left at large, yet he had been made to promise not to leave the parish. 'Twas said that Borgar and Guttorm had been lucky enough to get away. John of Laugarbru had ridden out to Ramsdal for tidings and was to send word hither. Simon had been at Huseby at midday, but had not tarried long. All was well with the boys, but Narkvi and Bjorgulf had begged and begged him to take them with him. Kristin had got back her courage and calm when, late in the evening, Simon sat by her on the bed's edge. She lay in the grateful weariness that comes after racking pains are gone, and looked at her brother-in-law's heavy, sunburned face and small, strong eyes. It stayed and comforted her that he had come. Simon grew most grave indeed when he heard more fully how the matter stood, but yet he spoke hearteningly. Kristin lay looking at the elk-skin belt round his bulky waist. The great flat buckle of copper thinly coated with silver, without other adornment than a pierced A and M betokening Ave Maria. The long dagger with the silver-gilt mountings, and great rock crystals set in the hilt. The poor little table knife with the handle of cracked horn mended with brass bands. All this she had known ever since she was a child, as part of her father's everyday gear. She remembered when Simon had got these things. Just before her father died, he had been minded to give Simon his gilded best belt and silver to make plates enough to lengthen it to fit his son-in-law. But Simon begged he might be given this one, and when Lavran said he was cheating himself, Simon would have it that the dagger, at least, was a costly piece. "Aye, and then the knife," said Ranfried with a little smile. And then the men laughed and said, "Ah, yes, the knife, to be sure." For about this knife her father and mother had had so much debate. It was a daily and hourly vexation to Ranfried to see such an ugly paltry thing at her husband's belt. But Lavran swore she should never gain her end and part him from it. "Never have I drawn it against you, Ranfried, and it is as fine a knife as any in Norway's land to cut butter with, when 'tis hot enough." Kristin begged Simon to let her see the knife, and lay a while with it in her hands. "I could wish that I owned this knife," she said softly and beseechingly. "Aye, that I can well believe, and glad am I that I own it. I would not sell it for 20 marks. He caught her wrists laughingly and took the knife back from her. Simon's small, plump hands were always so good to touch, so warm and dry. A little after he bade her good night, took the candle and went into the hall. She heard him kneel before the crucifix in there, stand up again, throw off his boots on the floor, and then in a little lie heavily down on the bed by the north wall. Then Kristin sank into a fathomless sweet sleep. She did not wake till far on in the next day. Simon Anderson had gone out long before, and the housefolk had orders from him to pray that she should stay quietly at home in the house. It was well nigh the middle of the afternoon before he came back, but he said at once, "I bear you greetings from Erland, Kristin. I came to speech with him." He saw how young her face grew, how soft and anxiously tender. So he took her hand in his while he told his story. It was not much that he and Erland had been able to say to each other, for the man that had brought Simon to the prisoner had stayed by them all the time. Olaf Lagmand had got Simon leave for this visit, for the sake of the kinship that had been between them while Halfrid lived. Erland sent loving greeting to her and the children. He had asked much about them all, but most of all about gout. Simon thought that in some days Kristin might get leave to see her husband. Erland had remained calm and in good heart. "Had I gone with you today, I might have seen him too," said the wife softly. Simon said no. He had got in because he came alone. "In many a case, Kristin, it may be easier for you to make way when a man goes ahead of you." Erland was kept in a room in the east tower, out towards the river, one of the gentlefolk's rooms, though a small one. Ulf, they said, was in the dungeon, Haftor in another cell. Warily feeling his way to make sure how much she could bear, Simon told her what he had heard in the town. When he saw that she already understood the case to the full, he didn't bother hiding from her that he too thought it was a perilous matter. But all those he had talked to said it was not possible Erland could have dared to plan such an undertaking, and to carry it forward as far as he had done, except he was sure he had a great part of the knights and the nobles at his back. And since the malcontent great folk were so strong in numbers, it was not like that the king would dare to deal too hardly with their leader, but rather he must let Erland make his peace with him in some fashion. Kristin asked in a low voice, "Where does Erling Vidkundsen stand in this matter?" "That I can see many a man would give something to know," said Simon. Though he didn't say it to Kristin, and had not said it to the men with whom he had talked of this, it seemed to him little likely that Erland should have at his back any powerful band of men who had bound themselves to risk life and goods in such a perilous affair. Had it been so, they would scarce have chosen him for their chief, for all knew that Erland was rash and unstable. It was true that he was kinsman to Lady Ingeborg and the young pretender. He had enjoyed much power and esteem in these latter years. He was not quite so unpractised in war as were most men of an age with him. He was known as one that his men liked and followed, and though he had so often borne him witlessly, yet could he, when he would, speak well and to the point, so that it might well be thought he had now at long last learnt prudence from his mischances. Simon thought it was most like there were some who had known of Erland's undertaking and had pushed him forward, but he could scarce believe that they had bound them so strongly that they could not draw back now and leave Erland to bear the brunt alone. Simon thought that he had seen that Erland himself looked for nothing else, and that his mind seemed made up to having to pay dearly for his desperate venture. When cows lie mired, 'tis for the owners to hang on to their tails, he said, laughing a little. But to be sure, Erland had not been able to say much, with the third man listening. Simon marvelled that this meeting with his brother-in-law had moved him so much. But the narrow little turret chamber where Erland had prayed him to take a seat on the bed, it went from wall to wall and filled half the room. Erland's straight, slender form as he stood by the little slit in the wall whence the light came. Erland, quite unafraid, clear-eyed, untroubled by either fear or hope. He was a fresh, cool, manful fellow. Now all the clogging cobwebs of love-dalliance and foolery with women had been blown from off him. True, it was women and the commerce of love that had brought him hither, with all his daring plans that were ended ere yet he had brought them into the light. But on that Erland seemed not to think. He stood there like a man who had dared a desperate throw, had lost it, and knew how to suffer defeat well and manfully. And his wondering and joyful thankfulness when he saw his brother-in-law sat well on him. Simon had said, when he saw it, "Do you remember, kinsman, that night we watched together by our father-in-law? We gave one another our hands, and Lavrans laid his hand on ours. And we promised him and each other that we would stand together like brothers all our days." "Aye!" Erland's face lit up with a smile. "Aye, and I guess Lavrans never thought that you would ever need my help." "No," said Simon, unmoved. "'Tis most like he thought you, as you were placed, might well prove useful to me, and not that you were likely to need help from me." Erland smiled again. Lavrans was a wise man, Simon, and, strange as it may sound, I know that he liked me well. Simon thought, yes, it was strange, God knew. Yet even he himself, despite of all he knew of Erland and all the other had done to him, even he could not help now feeling somewhat of a brother's tenderness toward Kristin's husband. Then Erland asked of her. Simon told him of how he had found her sick and full of fear for her husband. Olaf Hermannsson had promised to do his best to have her let in to see him as soon as Sir Bard came home. "Not before she is well," said Erland quickly. A strange flush, like a young girl's, passed over his brown, unshaven face. "'Tis the one thing I dread, Simon, that I should not have strength enough to bear it well when I see her." But in a little he said, as calmly as before, "I know that you will stand by her faithfully, if she should be left a widow this year. Penniless they will not be, she and the children, having her heritage from Lavrans, and she will have you nearby, should she dwell at Jorengard." The day after the Nativity of St. Mary, the High Steward, Sir Ivar Ogmundsson, came to Nidaros. 12 of the king's sworn liegemen from north of Dover were named now as a court to try Erland Nikolausson's case. Sir Finn Ogmundsson, the High Steward's brother, had been chosen to set forth the charge against him. Some time before this, in the summer, Hafthor Olafsson of Godoy had slain himself with the little knife that each prisoner had been allowed to keep to cut his food with. Folk said that prison had so told on Hafthor that he had not been in his right mind. Erland said to Simon, when he heard of it, that now he need have no fear of Hafthor's tongue. Yet he was much moved. As time went on, it happened now and then that the guards would make themselves an errand outside when Simon or Kristin was with Erland. Both of these two saw and spoke of it to each other that Erland's first and last thought was to come through this business without the names of those with him in the plot being discovered. To Simon one day he said so straight out. He had promised all who had joined in his counsels that he would hold the rope, so that if it came to the worst, the blow should fall on his hands only. "And never yet have I betrayed any man that put their trust in me," he said. Simon looked at the man. Erland's eyes were blue and clear. 'Twas plain that he said this of himself in all good faith. Nor had the king's agents yet been able to track down any other who had taken part in Erland's treason, save the brothers Griep and Torvald Torresons of Moor. And these would not confess that they had known the intent of Erland's plan to be anything else than that he and other men had moved the Duchess to let Prince Hakon Knutsen be brought up in Norway. Afterwards it was meant that the chiefs should make prayer to King Magnus that it would be for the good of both his kingdoms if he gave his half-brother the name of king in Norway. Borgar and Guttorm Tronson had been lucky enough to escape from the palace at Vioi. None could say how, but folk guessed that Borgar had got help from some woman. He was a comely youth and something of a light liver. Ivar was still imprisoned in Majot's castle. Young Havard, his brothers seemed to have kept outside their councils. While the meeting of king's men sat in the castle, the archbishop held a concilium in his palace. Simon was a man with many friends and acquaintances. He could thus tell Kristin what was going forward. All thought it likely that Erland would be outlawed and banished, and his lands and goods be forfeit to the king. Erland agreed. He was in good heart. He meant to seek refuge in Denmark. As things stood in that land, the road to advancement was ever open to a man of mettle and skill in arms, and Lady Ingeborg would surely welcome his wife as her kinswoman and keep her with her in all seemly honour. Simon would have to take the children, except the two eldest ones, whom Erland was minded to have with him in Denmark. Kristin had not been outside the city for a day in all this time, and had not seen her children save Nakvi and Bjorgulf. They had come riding into the courtyard one evening alone. Their mother kept them with her for some days, but then she sent them to Rasfold, where Lady Gunnar had taken the little ones to be with her. Erland wished it should be so, and Kristin was afraid of the thoughts that might arise in her if she were to see her sons about her, listen to their questions, and try to make things clear to them. She strove to thrust away from her all thoughts of her wedded years at Huseby. So rich had been those years that they seemed to her now to have been one great calm, even as there seems a sort of calm on a billowy sea when one stands high enough above it on a great cliff. The waves that chase each other seem everlasting and unchanging. Even so had life billowed through her soul in those spacious years. Now was it with her again as in her youth, when she had pitted her will to win Erland against all things and all men. Now again was her life but a waiting from hour to hour, between the hours when she saw her husband, sat by his side on the bed in the turret chamber of the castle, talked with him calmly and evenly, till by some chance they would be left alone for a moment, and would fall into each other's arms with endless passionate kisses and wild embraces. At other times she sat in Christ Church hours at a time. She kneeled gazing up at St. Olaf's golden shrine behind the grated lattice of the choir. Lord, I am his wife. Lord, I held fast to him when I was in sin and unrighteousness. Through God's mercy were we two, all unworthy, joined together in holy wedlock. Seared with the brands of sin, weighed down with sin's burden, we came together to the threshold of God's house, and together received the body of our Redeemer from the priest's hands. Should I now murmur if God puts my faithfulness to the proof? Should I think of nothing else than that I am his wife and he is my husband, as long as we both live? The Thursday before Michaelmas, the meeting of the King's Court was held and judgment given on Erland Nikolauson of Huseby. He was found guilty of having plotted to despoil King Magnus of land and lieges by treachery, to raise revolt against the king within the land, and to lead into Norway forces hired from outside. After having made search into all such cases in former times, the judges decreed that Erland Nikolauson had forfeited his life and all his goods into King Magnus's hands. Arne Svaldsen came down to Simon Dar and Kristin Lavransdatter in the Nikolaus townhouse. He had been at the meeting. Erland had not tried to deny what he had done. Clearly and firmly he had acknowledged his purpose, by these measures to force King Magnus to give his young half-brother, Prince Hakon Knudsen-Pors, the kingship of Norway. Arne had thought that Erland spoke exceeding well. He had pointed to the great hardship and troubles suffered by the people of the land, by reason that the king in these later years had scarce set foot on Norway soil, and had ever shown unwillingness to appoint stadtholders who could do justice and wield the kingly powers. By reason of the king's undertakings in Skarn and of the wastefulness and the unwisdom in money matters that were shown by the men he most hearkened to, the folk suffered oppression and impoverishment, and could never feel safe from new demands for help and new-fangled taxes. Since the Norwegian knights and esquires bearing arms had far fewer rights and liberties than the Swedish knighthood, it was hard for them to contend with the Swedes on equal terms, and it was but reason and nature that a man like Sir Magnus Ericsson, young and unskilled in affairs, should hearken more to his Swedish lords and love them more, since they had greater riches and therefore more power to support him with well-armed and well-trained warriors. He and his confederate friends had thought they had such sure knowledge of the minds of the greatest part of the folk, both nobles, peasants and townsmen, in the north and west of Norway, that they had not doubted at all that they would find full following there, if they could bring forward a prince as nearly akin to their dear lord, King Hakon of blessed memory, as he they had now. He had looked that then the folk of the land would agree together that we should move King Magnus to let his brother mount the throne here, while Prince Hakon should swear to main peace and brotherhood with King Magnus, to guard the realm of Norway in accordance with the ancient boundaries, to uphold the rights of God's church, the laws and customs of the land as handed down from of old, and the rights and liberties of both country folk and townsmen, and to put a stop to foreigners forcing their way into the kingdom. This plan it had been his and his friends' intent to put before King Magnus in a friendly way. It had always been the right of Norwegian farmers and chieftains to set aside a king who tried to rule unlawfully. Of Ulf Saxesson's doings in England and Scotland, he said that Ulf's intent was but to win favour there for Prince Hakon, if so be God would grant that he became our lord. With him in this undertaking there had been no Norseman, saving Hafthor Olafsson of Godoy, to whose soul God be merciful, his kinsmen Trond Giesling's 3 sons of Sundbu, and Grip and Torvald Torresons of the Hatterberg kindred. Erlend's words had moved his hearers strongly, said Arnish Valdsen. But at the end, when he spoke of the support they had looked for from the church's men, he had recalled those old rumours of the time when King Magnus was not yet grown up, and that, Arnd thought, had been unwise. The Archbishop's officer had taken him sharply to task. Archbishop Paul Bardson, as they knew, both while he was Chancellor and since, bore great love towards King Magnus by reason of the king's godly turn of mind, and folk were fain now to forget that such rumours had ever been spread about their king. Besides, he was even now about to wed a lady, the Count's daughter of Namur. Had there ever been any truth in the matter, it must be thought now that Magnus Ericsson had altogether turned him from all such things. Arnish Valdsen had shown Simon Anderson the greatest friendliness while Simon had been in Nidaros. It was Arnd too who now reminded Simon that it must be open to Erlend to appeal from this judgment, as unlawfully come to. According to the words of the law, the charge against Erlend should have been brought forward by one of his peers. But Sir Finn of Hestbu was a knight and Erlend but an esquire. It might well be, thought Arn, that a new court would find that a harder punishment than outlawry could not be awarded Erlend. As for what Erlend had set forth concerning the kind of kingly rule he deemed this land would best be served with, it had sounded fair and fine truly. And all men knew where the man was to be found who would have been glad enough to take the helm and steer this course, while the new king was in his nonage. Arn scratched the grey stubble on his chin and glanced across at Simon. "Has no one heard from him or of him this summer?" asked Simon in a low voice. "No. He says, I did hear, that he is out of favour with the king and stands outside all such matters. 'Tis many a long day since he had been content to sit so long at home and listen to Lady Erlend's talk. His daughters are as fair and as dull as their mother, folk say." Erlend had heard the doom of the court with steadfast calm, And he had saluted the members of the court as mannerly, freely and fairly when he was led out as when he had come in. He was calm and cheerful when Kristin and Simon were granted speech with him next day. Arne Valdsen was with them, and Erlend said that he would follow Arne's counsel. "Never could I bring Kristin here to come with me to Denmark in former days," he said, putting an arm about his wife's waist. "And I had ever a mind to go forth into the world with her." A kind of quiver passed over his face, and of a sudden he kissed her pale cheek vehemently, heedless of the two lookers-on. Simon Andersen rode out to Huseby to take order for the moving of Kristin's goods to Jørundgaard. He counselled her to send the children too to Gudbrandsdal at the same time. Kristin said, "My sons shall not depart from their father's house till they are driven out." "I would not wait for that if I were in your place," said Simon. "They are so young they can scarce rightly understand this matter. 'Twere better you let them leave Huseby believing that they are going just to visit their mother's sister, and to see their mother's heritage in the Dale." Erlend agreed with Simon in this. But the upshot was that only Ivar and Skule went south with their aunt's husband. Kristin could not send the two little ones so far away from her. When Lavrans and Munin were brought to her in the townhouse, and she saw that her youngest son didn't know her again, she quite broke down. Simon had not seen her shed a tear since the first evening he came to Nidaros. But now she wept and wept over Munin as he sprawled and struggled, close pressed in his mother's arms, striving to come to his foster-mother. And she wept over young Lavrans, who crept up into her lap and caught her round her neck, weeping because she wept. So she kept the two with her, and Gout too. He was unwilling to go with Simon, and it seemed to her unwise to let this child, who was bearing a load all too heavy for his years, out of her sight. Sira Eilif had brought the children to the city. He had prayed the archbishop to let him leave his church a while and visit his brother at Tautra, and this was readily granted to Erlend Nikolausen's house priest. And since it seemed to him that Kristin could scarce take care of so many children while staying alone in the city, he proffered to take Narkby and Bjorgulf out with him to the cloister. The last night before the priest and the boys were to set forth, Simon had already left with the twins, Kristin made confession to the holy and pure-hearted man who had been her spiritual father all these years. They sat together many hours, and Sira Eilif was instant with her to be humble and obedient towards God, and be patient, faithful and loving towards her husband. She knelt by the bench where he sat. Then Sira Eilif rose up and knelt by her side, still bearing the red stole, the token of the yoke of Christ's love, and prayed long and fervently without words. But she knew that he prayed for the father and mother and the children and all the households, whose soul's health he had so faithfully striven to further all these years. The day after, she stood on the shore at Bratteren and watched the lay brothers from Tautra setting sail on the boat that was to bear away the priest and her two eldest sons. On the way home she went into the Minorites' church and tarried there till she thought she was strong enough to venture back to her own house. And in the evening, when the two little ones were gone to sleep, she sat with her spinning and told Gout stories till it was bedtime for him too.